Imagine you are a journalist. You have spent months filing Freedom of Information requests. You have spoken to survivors, reviewed court documents, cross-referenced flight logs, and financial records. The story you are chasing involves one of the most powerful networks of wealth and influence in modern American history. A story of systematic abuse, institutional protection, and decades of enabled predation. You know that somewhere in government archives sit millions of pages of documents that could answer critical questions about who knew what, when they knew it, and who looked the other way. Now imagine Congress passes a law mandating the release of those documents within 30 days. Imagine the president signs it into law. Imagine the deadline arrives, and what you receive is a stack of papers so heavily redacted that 500 pages are entirely black. Imagine 16 files disappearing from the public website without explanation. Imagine faulty digital redactions allowing curious citizens to recover blacked-out text, revealing information officials tried to hide. Imagine the government claiming it has released all required documents while acknowledging that it identified 6 million pages but only released half. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is the Epstein Files release of December 2025 and January 2026. Welcome to History Repeating. I am your host, and today we are examining what happens when powerful institutions are forced to release documents they would rather keep secret. The Epstein Files Transparency Act passed Congress with near-unanimous support in November 2025. The Department of Justice was given 30 days to release all documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, his associates, his crimes, and the institutions that enabled him. What followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic obstruction. Heavily redacted releases, missing files, claims of compliance despite withholding half the identified documents, and a growing public conviction that something is being hidden. If this pattern feels familiar, you are right. It is deeply familiar. The mechanics have evolved with technology. We now have PDFs instead of photocopies, digital redactions instead of black markers, but the architecture underneath is ancient. Today we are going to trace that architecture through 3 of the most consequential document releases in American history. The Pentagon Papers in 1971, the Catholic Church abuse records spanning decades, and the Watergate tapes and files from 1972 to 1974. Each of these cases reveals the same recurring patterns: initial resistance, partial compliance, strategic redaction, claims that national security or institutional reputation requires secrecy, and the slow, grinding process by which truth eventually emerges, often years or decades late. By the end of this video, you will understand why document releases matter, why powerful institutions fight them so hard, and what history teaches us about distinguishing legitimate secrecy from institutional self-protection. Because the Epstein files are not just about one man's crimes, they are about a much older question. What happens when the people demand to see what their institutions have been hiding? History does not just teach us what happened. It teaches us what keeps happening in slightly different forms. Part 1. The Epstein Files. What we know and what we don't. Before we look backward in time, we need to establish exactly where we are. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier and convicted sex offender who operated a trafficking network that victimized dozens of underage girls over more than a decade. He cultivated relationships with some of the most powerful people in the world: presidents, princes, scientists, business leaders, academics. He owned a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands where much of the abuse occurred. He was arrested in July 2019 on federal charges of sex trafficking minors. He died by suicide in a Manhattan jail cell 1 month later, in August 2019, under circumstances that sparked intense public scrutiny and conspiracy theories. In November 2025, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act in a 427-1 vote. The Senate approved it unanimously the same day. President Trump signed it into law on November 19, 2025. The law required the Department of Justice to release all unclassified records related to Epstein, his associates, his detention, his death, and any investigative materials within 30 days, a deadline of December 19, 2025. The law was unusually specific and unusually strict. It prohibited redactions based on embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity. It required the release of communications about the destruction or concealment of documents. It mandated disclosure of all government officials and politically exposed persons named in the files, with no redactions permitted for those categories. The only allowable redactions were for classified national security information, personally identifiable information of victims, and information that would compromise ongoing investigations. On December 19th, the Department of Justice released its first batch of files. The release drew immediate bipartisan criticism. Over 500 pages were entirely blacked out. A 119-page document labeled Grand Jury-NY was completely redacted, every single page. 3 consecutive documents totaling 255 pages were similarly rendered unreadable. Crucial FBI interviews with Epstein's accusers and internal Justice Department memos on charging decisions were blacked out. Less than 24 hours after the release, 16 files disappeared from the public website without explanation. Among the vanished files was a photograph showing President Trump. The faulty digital redactions became a scandal of their own. Members of the public discovered that they could recover blacked-out content by copying and pasting text from the PDFs, revealing information officials had intended to withhold. This technical failure exposed details about the trafficking ring's members and methods that the Department of Justice had tried to hide. On January 30, 2026, the Department of Justice released an additional 3.5 million pages of documents, including 180,000 images and 2,000 videos. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche claimed this release brought the department into full compliance with the law. But the math did not add up. The Department of Justice had identified over 6 million pages as potentially responsive to the law's requirements. It had released only 3.5 million. Representative Ro Khanna and other lawmakers challenged the claim of compliance, noting that the department was withholding more than half of the documents it had identified. Public opinion polls told a clear story. In December 2025, an Economist/YouGov poll found that 55% of Americans disapproved of Trump's handling of the Epstein investigation. In January 2026, that disapproval had risen to 56%. A CNN poll found that only 6% of Americans said they were satisfied with what the federal government had released. Nearly half of Republicans, 3/4 of independents, and 9 in 10 Democrats believed the government was withholding information. According to a January 2026 poll, 49% of Americans believed Trump was attempting to cover up Epstein's crimes. This is where we are. A law passed with near universal support, a 30-day deadline missed, a release so heavily redacted that it prompted accusations of law-breaking from both parties, files that vanished from public view, technical failures that revealed the government's redaction strategy, and a widespread public belief that critical information is still being withheld. The question is not whether this pattern is new. The question is how many times it has happened before. Part 2. The Pentagon Papers, When the Government Hides a War. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a comprehensive study of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The study would become known as the Pentagon Papers. Officially titled United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1968, it consisted of 7,000 pages across 47 volumes, produced by 36 military personnel, historians, and defense analysts. The report was classified top secret. It documented systematic deception by 4 presidential administrations about the true nature and scope of American involvement in Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers revealed that President Harry Truman had given military aid to France in its colonial war against the Viet Minh, directly involving the United States in Vietnam years before the public knew. They showed that President Dwight Eisenhower had decided to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam and undermine North Vietnam's government. They documented that President John F. Kennedy had transformed what he inherited as a limited-risk gamble into a broad commitment. Most damningly, they proved that President Lyndon Johnson had begun planning for overt war in Vietnam a full year before the American public was told about the depth of U.S. involvement, and that he ordered bombing campaigns despite intelligence assessments concluding they would not work. Daniel Ellsberg, a defense analyst who had worked on the study, became convinced that the American people deserved to know what their government had been doing. In October 1969, he began secretly photocopying the documents. He first tried to give them to anti-war senators, hoping they would read the papers into the public record. They refused. In March 1971, increasingly frustrated, Ellsberg gave portions of the Pentagon Papers to Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing a series based on the Pentagon Papers. The Nixon administration moved immediately to suppress further publication, citing national security concerns. The Times published 2 more articles before the government obtained a temporary restraining order. The Washington Post, which had also received portions of the papers, began its own series. The government sought injunctions against both newspapers. The case moved with extraordinary speed. Within 2 weeks, it reached the Supreme Court. On June 30, 1971, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspapers in New York Times Company v. United States, a landmark First Amendment decision affirming that prior restraint, government censorship before publication, could only be justified under the most extreme circumstances. The government had failed to meet that burden. But the parallels to the Epstein files do not end with the initial release and government resistance. They extend to what happened afterward and to how long it took for the full truth to emerge. Although portions of the Pentagon Papers were published in 1971, the complete unredacted study was not released until 2011, 40 years later. Throughout those 4 decades, government agencies kept thousands of pages needlessly classified, refusing to respond to declassification requests. Even the blue cover of the report was classified. The Solicitor General who argued the government's case before the Supreme Court, Erwin Griswold, later admitted that the case for secrecy had been baseless. "I have never seen any trace of a threat to the national security from the publication," he said. And there is one more critical parallel. The Nixon administration's response to the Pentagon Papers leak did not stop at legal proceedings. Nixon created a special investigations unit, informally called the Plumbers, to stop leaks and destroy Ellsberg's credibility. The Plumbers' first assignment was to break into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, hoping to find embarrassing information. They found nothing, but the illegal break-in would later contribute to the dismissal of criminal charges against Ellsberg. The Plumbers did not stop there. 9 months after burglarizing Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, members of the same unit broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The Pentagon Papers leak led directly to Watergate, which led to Nixon's resignation. A government document release that officials claimed would threaten national security ultimately threatened only the presidency of the man who tried to suppress it. The pattern is unmistakable. Initial classification justified by national security, resistance to release, partial compliance under legal pressure, decades of unnecessary continued secrecy, and eventual revelation that the secrecy protected not the nation, but the reputations of officials who had lied. Part 3. The Church Abuse Files, When Institutions Protect Themselves. The Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal provides a different but equally instructive parallel to the Epstein files release. This is not a government cover-up, but an institutional one, and it reveals how powerful organizations respond when forced to disclose documents that implicate their own members and leadership. In June 1985, the National Catholic Reporter published an investigation by journalist Jason Berry into Father Gilbert Goth, a Louisiana priest who had sexually abused dozens of boys. Berry's reporting, based on court documents and sworn testimony, revealed that Bishop Gerald Fry had known about Goth's abuse for a decade before his arrest, but had not removed him from ministry. Instead, the bishop moved Gouthie from parish to parish, a practice that would later become known as priest shuffling. It was, Berry said, really the story of a cover-up. That pattern, abuse, institutional knowledge, transfer rather than removal, protection of the institution over victims, would prove to be systemic. In January 2002, the Boston Globe published the beginning of its spotlight investigation into sexual abuse by Catholic clergy in the Archdiocese of Boston. The Globe's reporting documented that Cardinal Bernard Law and other church officials had known about abuse allegations against priests for years and had responded by moving those priests to new parishes where they continued to abuse children. The Globe identified nearly 150 victims of a single priest, John Geoghegan. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse involving hundreds of priests and thousands of victims across decades. The Globe's work prompted investigations across the country. A study commissioned by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and released in 2004 found more than 10,000 complaints of abuse against over 4,000 priests between 1950 and 2002. In 2018, a Pennsylvania grand jury issued a 900-page report detailing 70 years of abuse in that state alone, documenting 300 priests and more than 1,000 identifiable victims. The grand jury found that church officials followed what it called a playbook for concealing the truth. As the report stated, priests were raping little boys and girls, and the men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all, for decades. In April 2023, Maryland Attorney General Anthony Brown released a 463-page report on the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the oldest Catholic diocese in the United States. The report identified 156 abusers, though 10 names were redacted, who had abused more than 600 children since the 1940s. The Attorney General's office had reviewed over 100,000 pages of documents. The report detailed physical abuse, sexual abuse, rape, and systematic institutional cover-up. Brown described it as illustrating the depraved, systemic failure of the Archdiocese to protect the most vulnerable. Here is where the parallel to the Epstein files becomes precise. The Baltimore report was heavily redacted. 10 abusers' names were completely removed. 37 people's identities were entirely redacted. 60 others were rephrased in the document to avoid identification. The court indicated it would consider releasing a more complete version in the future, the same pattern we see with government documents, where initial releases are incomplete and the full truth emerges only through continued pressure and litigation. Similar patterns appeared globally. In Ireland, a 2009 report documented widespread abuse in more than 250 church-run institutions, finding that government inspectors had failed to intervene. A 2009 report on the Archdiocese of Dublin concluded that clerical child sexual abuse had been covered up from 1975 to 2004. In Australia, inquiries found that church officials, including Cardinal George Pell, had known about abuse for decades and failed to act. By 2017, the Australian Church had paid over $200 million in compensation to thousands of victims. The institutional pattern is identical across jurisdictions. Systematic abuse by people in positions of power and trust, institutional knowledge of that abuse, active concealment through transfers and suppression of complaints, resistance to disclosure, partial releases under legal or public pressure, heavy redactions that protect perpetrators more than victims, and eventual acknowledgement, decades late, that the secrecy served institutional reputation, not legitimate privacy concerns. The Epstein files follow the same architecture. Documents exist. Institutions possess them. The public demands release. Officials cite legitimate-sounding reasons for secrecy, protecting victims' privacy, safeguarding ongoing investigations, maintaining national security. What actually gets protected again and again are the institutions themselves and the powerful people connected to them. Part 4. Watergate, when tapes don't lie. The Watergate scandal provides the third and perhaps most direct parallel to the Epstein files, a case where document production, in this instance audio recordings, became the central battleground in determining whether powerful figures would be held accountable. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The break-in was initially dismissed as a third-rate burglary, but reporting by Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, aided by information from an anonymous source later revealed to be FBI official Mark Felt, gradually revealed connections to President Nixon's re-election campaign and to the White House itself. The investigation expanded. In May 1973, the Senate established a select committee to investigate. During testimony in July 1973, White House aide Alexander Butterfield revealed the existence of a secret taping system that had recorded all conversations in the Oval Office since 1971. The revelation transformed the investigation. If the president had discussed the Watergate break-in or its cover-up, those conversations were on tape. Both the Senate committee and Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon refused to release them, citing executive privilege. The legal battle over the tapes would define the final year of Nixon's presidency. In October 1973, Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Solicitor General Robert Bork, third in line, finally carried out the order. The Saturday Night Massacre triggered a constitutional crisis and intensified public demand for the tapes. Nixon's resistance continued through a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and escalated legal proceedings. In July 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in United States v. Nixon that the president must turn over the tapes. Nixon complied. What the tapes revealed was devastating. The recordings documented Nixon's direct involvement in covering up the Watergate break-in, including ordering the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. The evidence was incontrovertible. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. The parallels to the current moment are striking. In both cases, a legally mandated disclosure requirement meets institutional resistance. In both cases, claims of privilege or institutional prerogative are asserted to justify withholding documents. In both cases, partial compliance is presented as full compliance. In both cases, public pressure and legal intervention are required to force further disclosure. And in both cases, the documents in question are not abstract. They contain evidence of who knew what, when they knew it, and what they did or failed to do. The Watergate tapes taught a generation of Americans a critical lesson. When powerful figures insist that releasing documents would harm national security or institutional integrity, the truth is often simpler. The documents would harm them personally. The secrecy protects not the nation, but the officials who do not want to be held accountable for what the documents contain. Part 5. The recurring pattern. 3 historical cases, 3 different contexts, three identical patterns. First, the existence of damaging documents. In the Pentagon Papers case, the documents showed that 4 administrations had lied about Vietnam. In the church abuse cases, the documents showed that officials had known about abuse and protected abusers. In Watergate, the tapes showed that Nixon had directed a criminal cover-up. In each case, the documents existed, and their contents were explosive. Second, institutional resistance to disclosure. The Nixon administration tried to prevent publication of the Pentagon Papers and fought for a year to avoid releasing the Watergate tapes. The Catholic Church resisted investigations, withheld files, and settled cases under confidential agreements that prevented public disclosure. In each case, the institution claimed legitimate reasons for secrecy while working to protect itself. Third, partial compliance presented as full compliance. The government released portions of the Pentagon Papers, but kept the full study classified for 40 years. Church officials released names of some abusive priests while redacting others. Nixon released edited transcripts of the tapes, not the tapes themselves. In each case, the institution attempted to control the narrative by controlling what was disclosed. Fourth, heavy redaction of the most damaging material. In every case, the initial releases were strategically incomplete. The most incriminating portions were withheld, redacted, or hidden behind claims of privilege, privacy, or security. The pattern is so consistent that it functions as a tell. When officials heavily redact documents they were ordered to release, the redacted portions almost always contain the most important information. Fifth, the slow emergence of fuller truth through continued pressure. The Pentagon Papers were not fully declassified until 2011. Church abuse investigations continue to uncover new cases and new cover-ups decades later. Watergate documents continued to be released and analyzed for years after Nixon's resignation. In each case, the complete record emerged only through sustained public pressure, legal challenges, investigative journalism, and the passage of time. And sixth, the revelation that the claimed justifications for secrecy were pretextual. The Pentagon Papers did not threaten national security. Griswold, who argued the government's case, admitted as much. The church's redactions protected abusers more than victims. Nixon's claims of executive privilege were invoked to hide criminal conduct. In each case, when the full record eventually emerged, it became clear that secrecy had served institutional self-protection, not legitimate policy objectives. These are not coincidences. They are the standard operating procedure of powerful institutions facing demands for transparency about their own failures or crimes. The Epstein files release of 2025 to 2026 follows the same playbook with such fidelity that it reads like a case study. Part 6. Why documents matter. At this point, someone might reasonably ask, why does any of this matter? We know Epstein committed terrible crimes. We know his co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted. We know he had connections to powerful people. What difference does it make whether specific documents are redacted or withheld? The answer lies in what documents do that testimony and journalism cannot. Documents create accountability. They establish timelines. They show who knew what and when. They reveal patterns of decision-making and deliberation. They transform allegations into evidence, and they prevent revisionism. Without the Pentagon Papers, the government's lies about Vietnam could have been dismissed as policy disagreements or differences in judgment. The documents proved systematic deception. Without the church abuse files, officials could have claimed they acted on the best available information when they transferred abusive priests. The documents showed they knew exactly what they were doing. Without the Watergate tapes, Nixon could have maintained plausible deniability about the cover-up. The recordings eliminated that possibility. The Epstein files matter for the same reason. Somewhere in those 6 million pages are communications showing who knew about Epstein's activities and when. Somewhere in those files are records of how he avoided serious federal charges for so many years, despite clear evidence of his crimes. He received an extraordinarily lenient non-prosecution agreement in 2008 that granted immunity to potential co-conspirators. Somewhere in those documents are names of people who participated in or enabled his trafficking network. And somewhere in those files are answers to why systems that should have stopped him failed. When officials claim that releasing those documents would harm victims or compromise investigations, we should ask, how many of the victims who have spoken publicly have said they want the files kept secret? How many ongoing investigations actually exist, and how would disclosure harm them? These are questions that can be answered, but only if we demand answers. The January 30th, 2026 release included victims' names that were not redacted, while perpetrators' names were blacked out. Attorneys for survivors noted that the Justice Department failed to redact the identities of at least 31 people who were victimized as children. The brother of Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most prominent accusers who died by suicide in 2025, said, "They're redacting the names of perpetrators, and they're unredacting the names of victims, quite the opposite of what the Epstein Files Transparency Act was meant to do." That inversion, protecting the powerful while exposing the vulnerable, is not an accident. It is a choice embedded in how institutions approach disclosure. And it is precisely why independent oversight, public pressure, and historical awareness matter. Part 7. The Cost of Delay. There is another dimension to this story that history illuminates with painful clarity: the cost of delaying disclosure. The Pentagon Papers were not fully released until 2011, 40 years after portions were leaked, 66 years after the events they documented began. By that point, most of the officials whose decisions the papers examined were dead. The opportunity for real accountability had passed. What remained was historical record, which matters, but which cannot undo the damage of decades of unnecessary war. The Catholic Church abuse cases show the same pattern. The Louisiana priest Gilbert Gout was convicted in 1985, but the National Catholic Reporter's investigation that year noted that church officials had known about his abuse since at least the mid-1970s. Boston's Spotlight investigation in 2002 documented abuse that had occurred throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. The Pennsylvania grand jury report in 2018 covered 70 years of abuse. In each case, delays in disclosure meant that abusers continued to have access to children, that survivors waited decades for acknowledgement, and that evidence degraded or disappeared. Many of the priests identified in recent investigations are now dead. The Maryland report on Baltimore noted that of the 156 identified abusers, many are deceased. Criminal prosecution becomes impossible. Civil accountability becomes harder. What could have been prevention becomes merely documentation. The Epstein case already shows this dynamic. Epstein is dead. His co-conspirator Maxwell is convicted, but questions remain about others who enabled or participated in the trafficking network. The FBI received a tip about Epstein's crimes in September 1996 from survivor Maria Farmer. She says officials failed to investigate. That was nearly 30 years ago. How many victims could have been spared if that early warning had been taken seriously? How many perpetrators have died or reached old age without facing consequences because the system that should have stopped them chose institutional protection instead? Delay is not neutral. Delay is a choice that favors the powerful. When documents that show wrongdoing are withheld for years or decades, the people who committed that wrongdoing age out of accountability. Witnesses die, evidence disappears, public attention moves on, and eventually the only consequence is a historical footnote. That is why the 30-day deadline in the Epstein Files Transparency Act mattered. That is why the Department of Justice's failure to meet it drew criticism from both parties. That is why the continued withholding of 3 million pages of identified documents is not a technical detail, but a substantive failure. Time matters. Accountability has an expiration date. Closing. What history teaches us to watch for? So what do we do with this historical knowledge? How does understanding the Pentagon Papers, the church abuse files, and Watergate help us evaluate the Epstein files' release? First, we should expect continued resistance. The Department of Justice claims it has released all required documents. History suggests that claim is almost certainly incomplete. There will be further litigation, further pressure, further releases. The question is how long that process takes and how much information is withheld in the interim. Second, we should scrutinize the justifications for redaction. When officials say information must be withheld to protect victims, we should ask which victims have requested that protection and whether the redactions actually serve that purpose or whether they disproportionately shield perpetrators. When officials cite ongoing investigations, we should ask what investigations exist and how disclosure would harm them. These are answerable questions. Third, we should recognize the pattern when we see it. Heavy redaction of initial releases, files that disappear from public access, technical failures that reveal information officials tried to hide, claims of compliance despite obvious gaps. These are not signs of good faith transparency. They are signs of institutional self-protection. Fourth, we should pay attention to who benefits from delay. The longer full disclosure takes, the more likely it is that people who could be held accountable will avoid consequences. This is not conspiracy thinking. This is pattern recognition based on historical precedent. And fifth, we should remember that disclosure battles are not abstract. They are about whether powerful people and institutions are subject to the same accountability as everyone else. The Pentagon Papers were about whether presidents could lie to the public about war. The church files were about whether religious institutions could cover up the abuse of children. The Watergate tapes were about whether a president was above the law. The Epstein files are about whether a network of powerful people who enabled or participated in sex trafficking can be held to account, or whether institutional protection will shield them. These questions matter because the answer shapes what happens next time. If institutions learn that aggressive resistance to disclosure works, that they can withhold documents, exceed deadlines, provide heavily redacted releases, and face no real consequences, then the next scandal will follow the same script. If, on the other hand, we insist on actual compliance with transparency laws, if we maintain pressure for full disclosure, if we refuse to accept partial answers to questions that demand complete ones, then we establish a different precedent. Daniel Ellsberg believed that the American people deserved to know what their government was doing in their name. The journalists at the Boston Globe believed that the Catholic Church's victims deserved the truth about institutional cover-ups. The investigators pursuing Watergate believed that the president should not be above the law. These were not radical positions. They were democratic ones. The Epstein files are a test of the same democratic principle. Do we, as a society, have the right to know what powerful institutions have hidden? Or does power come with the privilege of secrecy? History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The Epstein files release of 2025 to 2026 is rhyming with the Pentagon Papers, with the church abuse documents, with Watergate. The meter is familiar. The question is whether we recognize it. This is history repeating. Thank you for watching and for thinking with me today. If this video made you want to learn more, I recommend starting with David Rudenstein's The Day the Presses Stopped on the Pentagon Papers case, the film Spotlight, and the Boston Globe's archived reporting on the church abuse scandal, and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's All the President's Men on Watergate. All three offer essential insight into how institutions resist disclosure and how that resistance can be overcome. If you found this useful, share it. Not for the algorithm, but because understanding these patterns matters. Subscribe if you want to continue this kind of deep historical analysis together, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think about the Epstein files release. Tell me which historical parallel resonated most with you. Tell me what other cases we should examine. The past is not dead. It is not even past. And the documents they are trying to hide today will tell us, eventually, what they knew and when they knew it. The question is whether we will demand to see them while accountability is still possible.